And we're going to be going over how to arrange cutout elements in motion to create this animation that you see here. We'll be working with lights, cameras, and a bunch of layers from Photoshop that we worked on in class that we extracted. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is set our motion frame rate to 24, and we're going to do a 20-second animation with motion and hit open. What I want you guys to think about today is the idea of the diorama. We're going to be working in three-dimensional space on the z-axis. I'm just going to click my inspector tab so you can see that everything starts off directly here. We're going to need 4 groups, so I'm going to just go ahead and make those right now. 1, 2, I'm right-clicking on the background here and creating 4 new groups in addition to the group that started with. For the top group, I'm going to rename that front 500, and that will be 500 pixels to the front on the z-axis. So for instance, when I select this group and I go to the group, you can kind of see it's just a regular group. I'm going to open up my position tab, and I'm going to take everything that's in this group and move it 500 pixels to the front towards us by typing in 500 on the z-axis. For the mid group, I'm going to make that 0 because that's going to be the middle, so we're not going to move the pixels on the z-axis at all. For the group below the mid group, that's going to be the back group. And I'll just type back, and I'm going to put that negative 500 pixels behind the mid group. So we'll just go negative 500 in the z-axis here. And for the final group, or the second to final group, we're going to call this background. And I'm going to make that negative 1000. And I'm putting the information here so that we know that when we go into these groups, anything that gets put in these groups will be in that location physically in space. So negative 1000 pixels is what I want. So each of these groups is set up so we can start dragging stuff into it. The last group that I need is going to be from my Photoshop file, and so I'm just going to call this Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is select it, and I'm going to import my Photoshop document that we worked on in class. Now, if you don't have this document, I've made something available on the Media Workspace drive as well. It was called Cutout for me, but it's probably might be called something different from you. And you remember this had the fish, the castle, the shark, the waves, the clouds, all the things that we cut out in class together. I'm just going to head import that, and it's going to ask me, do I want to merge them? No, I do not. I want all the layers, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, step 1 before we start, here is our Photoshop document with each individual layer, but you know that this icon is not a group icon, so the first thing I want you to do is go to the Group tab for that Photoshop document and turn off fixed resolution. You always have to do that. Otherwise, you won't be able to move this stuff outside of the frame. So if you were to move the castle here, it would actually get cut off. So just remember, you have to take off this fixed resolution. If you see that icon, that's bad, so turn it off. Okay, let's get started arranging things. So I have this Photoshop group, and inside of that I have a castle. I'm going to turn that off. Big rock, I'm going to take the big rock, or this rock right here that you see, and I'm going to move that into my background group and let go. And notice by physically just moving it into that group, I'm going to hide this so you can see, it actually put it into the background group. Now here's the problem. The background is set to negative 1000. You see that? When I drag this Photoshop layer into that background group, Motion tried to help me by taking that big rock and adding 1000 pixels so that it would end up in the exact same place. So if I were to look at this rock is 1000 pixels in front of the background group. I don't want that, so I want you to select the big rock group and change the Z back to 0, and then hit return, and you notice it gets smaller because it's farther away. So now the big rock itself is at 0 pixels on the Z, but when you add that to the background group being a negative 1000, now it is behind stuff in the group here. Okay, the next thing I want you to do is add some more stuff to that folder. Let's go ahead and add the waves to the background. So now the waves are there, and again, select the waves and make the z-axis 0. because we want we want it to be in the background with the background at a negative 1,000. So 0 plus negative 1,000 is negative 1,000. We're going to need a couple more items. The cloud 3, the cloud 2, and that's it, I think. Oh, and the house. So those 3 items. Now they might be different in yours. I'm just going to kind of zoom up here and put it into the negative 1,000. I'm going to select all 3 because I can do it quicker if I select everything and change all 3 at the same time to 0. Okay. Now I'm going to close up my Photoshop document and I'm going to just show my background group here. So I'm going to turn this off. That means I can't see what's in this group. And now the only group I have is this background group here. Okay, so we knew that we had some clouds where we did the color removal so that the blues would go away. So we have that. We have the main clouds right here. We have a little house. We have some waves, a big rock. Those are what we're going to work with first. Let's start with the thing that's going to be at the farthest back, and that's clouds number 2, the main clouds. I'm going to turn everything else off using the little check boxes so you can see just the clouds. Keep the group turned on, obviously. And, oh, I accidentally put this in a different group. I don't know how that happened. There you go. All right, so I've just got my clouds. You can see they're not filling up the space. So what I'm going to do is take my clouds and scale them up just by clicking on the scale and adding a little bit of scale to them and make them bigger than they need to be. You can see if I select 50% for my window here, you can see I'm giving them a little bit of room because what I'm going to do is add a throw so that they slightly move from left to right. And you can see I have some extra stuff here. So I'm going to start it off at the beginning here, and I'm going to put the clouds where I want them, right here. I'm going to go to my behaviors, basic motion, throw, and I know I'm going to throw it in the X direction. So I open up the behavior X and I add like an 18-point throw so that by the end of the 20 seconds, you can see it's not moved very far off screen. So let's make it about 18. Okay, so if I look at this, I can see the clouds are moving slightly, but very slightly because they're really far away. Okay, put the playhead back to the beginning here and close up my clouds. Let's do the next thing, which is our waves. So let's put the waves, turn the waves on, put the waves here. Clearly they're too small, so if I hold the shift key down, that allows me to scale them proportionally, the waves, and I'm just going to bring them down here so that they're at the bottom here, and maybe I'll move the clouds, oops, a little bit higher. There we go. So far here's what we've got. Got the waves, and I've got the clouds moving relative to the waves, and they're going pretty nicely. Now the waves are a little bit boring, so what we're going to do is we're going to add some movement to the waves. We're going to add a filter. So the filter that we're going to add is called a refraction. So under filter distortion, you should see something called refraction. Now the cool part about refraction as a filter, adding it to the wave, is that you can see that if I change the softness, I can make it more or less soft. So maybe I want the softness to be right around, I think I wrote down some figures here, like 46% there. And notice my refraction number. If you change that, it looks like the waves are actually moving. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this refraction slider, and we're going to move this slider using oscillate, so it goes back and forth, just like this, right? Because if we don't, what we're going to get is just a static image with a little bit of a filter. But if we move this slider, you're going to get something that looks like waves moving, okay? So we're going to start the refraction off at about 68, right? And then right here, there's a little drop down, and this allows me to add a parameter, oscillate. So what I'm doing is I'm going to oscillate this parameter back and forth. So I'm going to select oscillate, and notice right now it jumps me from the filter tab, which is where we were, to the oscillate tab. And the oscillate settings that I want you guys to use is like 46 and 46 for the amplitude, 46, and the speed, 46. And so if we do that, what we get is these start to move, and you can kind of see they're moving back and forth, right? And if we look at the actual filter, you'll actually see this moving back and forth because we've added an oscillation to it. So now we have the clouds moving, and we can see that the waves are doing something. At least they're not just sitting there. All right, let's turn the big rock on, and let's bring that down. And what I'd like to have this rock do is be a little bit behind the waves so that it's in the distance, and a little bit smaller. So I'll hold the shift key down to make it smaller. And then what I'm going to do is just physically move the rock underneath or in between the clouds and the waves so that the clouds, the wave, the big rock, and the waves are in this order. And you can see now it's really far away. All right. I didn't want the house actually in here, so we'll fix that. The next thing I want to do is add these clouds in. So let's turn them on. You can see they're very small, so we're going to scale them up quite a bit like this. And what I'm going to do for these clouds is just move them to the left, put my playhead at the beginning, right? And then we're going to add a basic throw to these clouds, and we're going to move it in the X direction so the wind is going in the same direction. But this time we're going to go much further or much faster. You can kind of see that here. And I'm going to move my playhead to the end, and then I'm going to adjust the throw so that it's a little bit less, so it doesn't go too fast. And then move it so that, remember, this is the end, so the end should be somewhere like this. And then you can kind of see the clouds moving in front of the rock and in front of the waves, so that we have something in between the waves and the rock and the back clouds. Now, so far these clouds are a little bit too intense, so we can, if we wanted to, select those clouds, go to our opacity and change the opacity. But what I rather do is go to my blend mode. And what the blend mode does is it actually affects how the clouds interact with the background. So darken makes things darker. Well, clouds are not dark, so we want to actually use this group, which makes things lighter. So if I go to add, notice how it makes it lighter, lighten. Does a better job. I like the lighten, and it's just very subtle, but it acts a little bit more like an authentic cloud. So we're going to use the lighten blend mode for the clouds area. And now what I'm going to do with this house is it's in the wrong layer, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in the back 500 because I know that's where it's going to go. And I'm going to collapse this background layer. So this background layer is done. We can see that just moving left to right, we've got all the clouds, nothing goes off screen. Everything looks pretty good, and we've got a little bit of motion in the waves to give us a feeling that those are not just a static object. All right, let's work on our background objects that are -500. When I drag something into it, even if it's in a different one, it will automatically change the location. So I want to make that 0, just like before. We're going to need, in this background area, we're going to need the castle. We're going to need the cliff. And what else do we need? I think that is all we need. So we're going to close Photoshop up again, and we're going to focus on these background areas. Now, because the cliff is at 500 and the castle is at +500 for the Z, I'm going to make that 0 so that everything is nicely aligned. And I'm going to start with the thing that's furthest back. I'm going to move the cliff down a little bit. Oops, not too far down. I don't want to take it out of the group. Right here. And I'm going to position the cliff here, and holding the shift key down, I'm going to scale it up so it looks a little bit like this. Okay. Maybe a little down. Sorry. A little bit down so that I don't see the bottom of the cliff. Next thing I'm going to do is turn on the castle, and I'm going to physically move the castle. Here it is. Over here. So it feels like it's like part of that cliff. Maybe I'll even move the cliff over a little bit so that it feels more like this is the spot where the castle's supposed to be. All right. So now we have a cliff with a castle. Looks pretty correct. Now at this point you can see the rock being here might be something that I want to fix, move it over a little bit. So I can always go back to the big rock here and move it over to make it feel like it's in a separate part. Okay. The next thing I want to do is put the little house on the tip top of the hill. So holding the shift key down, I make it small, and I put it up here, and I zoom in holding the spacebar command key, just like in Photoshop, and holding the shift key down, make it small. Now I want it to be behind the cliff so that it looks like we're just seeing this little tiny house, but it's not physically like on the cliff, but it's behind the cliff. So I'm going to move it under the cliff, and being careful not to allow it to make its own group like I just did. Now it's really important you do it here and not here. So move it to the right under. Now I can actually bring it up, and that's kind of like what I want, right around, right like that. Okay, I'm going to zoom out using the command spacebar and zoom out, and use the spacebar to zoom. And you can see my cliff has moved a little bit, so I'll just move that down a little bit. So that makes sense, and that means I have to move actually all three of these things. So I'm just going to select all three with the shift select, and they can all move down a little bit and over. Okay, so we've got this scene so far. Let's see, what else do we got? Nothing else in the back. There is one more thing that should be behind the cliff from our Photoshop document, and that is going to be our hot air balloon. So I'm going to take my hot air balloon and put it into our background -1000. I'm going to change the Z location to be 0, right? And now we can see that balloon is behind everything. So when it floats by, it's actually behind everything, but it's on top of the background. So it's in front of this rock, in front of the water, those kinds of things. Let's hold the shift key down and make that a little bit smaller. And let's add a couple things to this balloon to give it a little bit of movement, right? So the two things that we're going to add, let's see, what do we got? We're going to add wind, which is a behavior simulation. And right here it is, simulation wind. We're going to add that to the hot air balloon. And this is different than throw because it's going to work with some of the other simulations that we have. I'm going to open up the velocity, and the velocity for wind, let's see what we've got. I have 1.7 for air thickness and 178 for velocity. So let's go ahead and do that. X is 178. And air thickness is like 2 or something like that. 1.7. There we go. So if we do that and just play it, you'll notice that it doesn't do anything different than a throw. A throw would normally do the same type of motion from left to right because the wind is blowing exactly at 178. Now you can add a little bit of Y direction and that makes it go up and down, but that's not interesting. What we want is the wind to do something with this balloon, to take it along. So let's go back to our simulations, and we're going to add a new simulation that adds to this, and it's going to be called random motion. Now when we do that, it's saying, okay, we've got some random motion. Let's go ahead and add our numbers here. What I have is 161 for the amount. Let's see what happens if we do that. Now it only goes to 50, and you already saw the line start to wiggle. But I can click on the word number 50 with my mouse, and I can go right to 171 or ish. And now all of a sudden you've got something that's not quite like a straight line. It's kind of random. And by clicking on this random seed, you can make lines change because it's different seeds will cause different results. And you notice how when I play this, it actually acts as if it was wind, right? And it's going in the X and the Y axes. I do not want it to go forward or backwards, so I'm turning off the Z here. Some of the other settings that I have for the random motion, let's see, the frequency is 1.8, noisiness is 0.29, and the drag is 0.4. So if I made this 0.4, which is just a little bit, it just slows it down a little bit. So something like that. The noisiness is, what did I say? 0.29, so I just make it a little smoother. I can make it more noisy if I wanted to, but smoother seems better. And then finally the frequency is how much it, kind of bobs. So 1.08 was fine, which is pretty close to where it was. So at this point, if I were to look at this scene that I have, let's go ahead and fit this to my frame here. You can see that I've got a balloon. It's moving with the wind. I can speed that up if I wanted to by using the velocity of the wind to speed that up. But it feels like it's moving, with the wind. Now to really sell this, I'm going to take this hot air balloon, collapse that up, and I'm going to move the cloud above it, the one that's in front. And what that will do is anytime the cloud is in front of it, it'll feel like the balloon is mashed between two sets of clouds, as you can kind of see here, right? So here's what we've got. Balloon goes off screen. So far, so good. I'm going to hit the space bar to stop it playing. I'm going to collapse the background 1000. We're done with that. I'm going to collapse the back 500. We're done with that. So let's select the mid area and put something in there. We're going to put the windmill in the mid and let go. Now the windmill, we're going to put way over here just to give a little sense of balance. And we're going to move it down a little bit. Notice that when I drag the windmill in, it's still at 0 because the mid group is at 0 pixels on the z-axis. So we don't have to do too much to that. Okay, so far so good. That's it for the mid group, so I'm going to close that up. Finally, the rest of the things that we're going to need, we're going to delete the background. We don't need a big white black background. We're going to delete the landscape because that just doesn't function with what we have. I'm going to take the fish and the shark, and I'm going to put them in the front group. In fact, the shark, really not sure how we're going to use that, so I'm going to delete the shark. And so we just have this fish. And it's in the front group, and remember, when we put something in a group that has a z position, we have to reset the z value to 0 for the object, so that is in fact in front. Now you notice how the fish is now in front of everything. I'm going to put the fish over here, by the way. And then I'm going to take this Photoshop document with the apple, and I'm just going to delete the whole thing, because right now we don't need it anymore. We already took all the layers we wanted, right? And so at this point, we're done with that. All right, the last thing we're going to do is talk about adding some motion to this fish. We're going to use a different type of motion than with the balloon. Actually, for the fish, we're just going to do just two basic functions. We're going to do a throw, and we're going to do a wiggle. So let's go ahead and basic motion throw. And we're going to start it from the left and move it right. So, or we could do it the other way around, actually. That might be interesting. So I'm going to take the fish and put it over here, and it's going to go with our balloon, but it'll be in front. And I'm going to throw this in the X direction until it goes off screen. So right now we've got this fish. So what's the problem? Well, you can see that the fish is in the wrong direction. Now I could grab this handle if I wanted to for the fish and rotate the fish like this, but that's upside down now. So that doesn't quite work. So how do we flip a fish around? It's a simple trick. Select the fish, go to properties, open up the scale tab, and watch what happens if I take the 100 and make it go negative. Negative 100 will flip things around. The same thing up and down. If you make the Y or the X scale negative, it's actually like flipping it. So I'm going to make it negative 100 because it's at 100%. And then I'm going to collapse the scale up. So now I can still use the slider, but the fish is now in the right direction. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to add a behavior. This time I'm going to add a parameter called wiggle, right? And this wiggle parameter, I'm going to add it to the up and down. In fact, I'm going to do X and Y. And what that does is it does this, which is not exactly what I'm hoping for, right? I was hoping for a little smoother thing. So I'm going to change the amount, lower it. I'm going to change the noisiness to make it very smooth. And then I'm going to only, I'm going to actually only throw it in the up and down so that the forward movement is always constant. So it's just kind of up and down like that. Finally, to sell this, I want the fish to kind of like to do something like this, wiggle around. Now, if I did it here, it seems like the center of mass of the fish is like right in the middle here, and I want to move that to the front. I want the front to move to have the place where it rotates. So we've done this before. I select my anchor point, and I move the anchor point to the front of the fish, and then go back to my selection tool. And now if I rotate this fish, you can kind of see, I'm going to try to grab it here while it's like doing things. You'll see that this fish rotates around this point right here. In fact, if I just go to rotate here, you can see it rotates like that. So what I'd like to do is have it just kind of rotating up and down like this. So that, to me, tells me that's like an oscillation. So I can select an oscillation from the behaviors, right, under parameters, oscillation. Or, because I know I want to apply this to the rotation, I can right-click here on this little drop down, and I can add the parameter oscillate to that directly. Now I know that it's oscillating, but it's too much. So I can go to my oscillation here, change my amplitude to like 1. See how that looks. Maybe the speed, I can increase it to maybe 100, maybe 96 or something, right? Maybe the, and then, I don't know, maybe the amplitude should be a little bit more. There we go. So here's what we've got. Looks like the fish is actually moving, and it's in front of everything. So maybe we want to take that fish and bring it down a little bit like this so that it feels like it's near the bottom here, right? Now, obviously, anything that we want to duplicate, we could always select it and Command D, as in dog, and that would duplicate the fish. So now we have 2 fish. The problem here is that both fish are swimming identically. That doesn't feel correct, but we can always go into our wiggle, change the speed of the wiggle. We can go into our throw and change the speed slightly of our throw or increase it, right? And we can go into our oscillate here, and then we can change the speed, the amplitude slightly, and even the phase of the thing. So now they feel, well, maybe this was too much of a change, but the phase definitely could be changed. So now it feels like they're swimming at different rates, right? So now we've got 2 fish. You could even change the size of the fish if you wanted to give it like, to make it a little bit more, to make it a little larger so it feels like it's more in the front, like that. So by the way, they're off screen here, so that's why you're not seeing them. So here we go. Maybe I want to bring this one in earlier so that it's on screen right away, and then the other one will come on screen. Okay, so you get the idea that once you've created a nice set of movements for an object, all you need to do is then duplicate that object. If I needed multiple balloons, I can do that, and then actually put them, in different locations in space, and they would kind of work. All right, to really finish this off and to sell it, I'm going to put my playhead at the beginning here. I'm going to go ahead and file save this. If you haven't saved, it's probably a good idea. Call it Diorama. And we're going to add a light, and we're going to add a camera. And those are the last things that we're going to add. So here's what we've got so far. I'm going to go to Add Object, Light. And the minute I do that, it's going to say switch to 3D, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to switch it to 3D, and you'll notice I now get a light, and notice the location. It's at 100 pixels in front of everything. But because I have some stuff like the fish, notice how these fish are not getting illuminated because they're in front of the light. The light is at 100 pixels. Right? Now, if I take this Z value and make it like 500, I'll get to see the fish. You can see I'm moving the light forward and backwards, right? Using the slider here. Now, the light is not very bright, so I'm going to select the light, go to the light tab, and I'm going to turn up the intensity of that light. And at this point, you notice the type of light it is. It's a point light. That means that if I move this light around, just like this, it'll actually light wherever it's close to. Now it's currently really far forward. You can see that it's at 300 pixels. If I bring this back a little bit closer to the cliff, you'll notice that the cliff now, you see how it's actually affecting things? Because the physical light is closer to these pieces of paper. So it's kind of like bringing your camera phone with the light on closer to these things. And that's because my Z value is now right in front of 500, right? Remember, these are negative 500, so my light is now at negative 400. Now, if I made the light go negative 501, you'll notice the cliff instantly goes black. Assuming the cliff is, oh, I forgot to do this. That's why, 0. I was going to say the cliff should be black at this point. Which is just what I had forgotten to move the cliff back to negative 100. I'm going to turn off the light for a second to make sure that everything is not messed up. And it does look like the cliff needs to get smaller. There we go. That's better. Okay, so the cliff is now in the right location. And let's turn the light back on. And you'll notice that when the light is behind when it's smaller than 500, it makes a silhouette. As soon as I bring it closer to 500, the closer I bring it to this area, the more it acts like a point light. You can kind of see that here. So you can use it to create a lamppost if you want, or do some other things, whatever you want. Now for me, what I would like to use this light for is just to kind of illuminate the cliff, and then as the animation goes on, it gets the light itself illuminates more things like this. Like it does this. It goes from maybe negative 468, where it's not illuminating too much, or negative 431, to maybe 200, where it illuminates more of the cliff, right? So what I'm going to do is actually keyframe the position of the light. So I'm going to click on the keyframes. Actually, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to put my playhead at the beginning. I'm going to set up the light to where I want it to start. Click on the keyframes for position. Then move to the end of the animation, and then physically move the light numbers so that they're more along the lines of where I want the light to actually be. So I'm going to move the light over here and a little bit forward. So now you can see the light is actually moving forward, but it's also illuminating the cliff and showing off the castle a little bit more over time. And those are my keyframes for my lights. Now overall, the whole scene itself needs a light, so we're going to add another light. There we go. But this type of light we're going to make is called an ambient light. That means it's everywhere, right? And obviously way too bright, because now I can't even see my little spotlight, right? Just barely. So what we're going to do is we're going to dial the intensity down of that ambient light so that it just kind of illuminates the scene slightly. And I'm going to give this ambient light a little bit of color, a little bit of orange right there. That'll make the entire scene, you can kind of see, you can make everything red or yellow or green. You can use the light to kind of gel everything up, use it as a filter, right? But we're going to use a little bit of orange just to make everything feel like it belongs in this frame. And the ambient light won't change, but that little spotlight will illuminate things a little bit more, you can kind of see. Okay, we're almost done. The last thing we're going to add is a camera. So let's go to Add Object Camera. Now, how do cameras work? Well, currently this camera looks like nothing's changed, but we're actually looking through the camera. When we added the camera and the light, we got this little drop-down tab. And I'm going to show you the perspective view of what we've done so far. Go to Perspective. And now I'm going to use these handles, being careful to only be in perspective. I'm going to use the orbit so you can kind of see, here's what we have. Do you see? So we have this in front, we have this, we have some fish way in the front, we have the windmill in the middle, we have our cliffs, and then behind the cliffs we have our clouds. You can kind of see, I can rotate around so I can show you how these things look in space. So this is our setup, right? And so with perspective, we can actually see how everything is layered. If we go back to active camera, we only have one active camera, and that's this one. But the cool part about the camera is that if we select our camera, it's called camera, by the way, but I can call it main camera. We can actually add some motion to this camera, because if I'm selecting the camera and I've got these things here, this allows me to zoom forward or back, right? I'm going to undo that. It allows me to orbit. Don't do that, because then you're going to break the believability of your diorama. And it also allows me to go up and down. So if I wanted to, I could keyframe this camera to be like wherever I wanted it to be. But an easy way to add motion to a camera is just to use some of the camera behaviors. Here are a few. So what we're going to do is just do a dolly, just a basic zoom in. And I'm just going to add some distance to this, and then I'm going to move this playhead to the end, and I'm going to bring the distance back down. And so here's what we got. We have a little bit of motion with the camera. Notice that the dolly is set to a constant motion. That's a constant zoom. I would like it to be ease in and ease out. So I'm going to ease both. That means it's going to slowly ramp up to moving, and then it's going to slow down near the end, right? One last thing I would like to do with this is notice the house is actually moving with the cliff. I want to open this up and check to see that that house is in the actual 0 property, and it's not. Notice that the cliff is at 0, the castle's at 0, but the house is at -500. So let's make that 0 and then reset the location of the house. Now make sure our transform tool is selected. If you changed to anchor point, you want to fix that. And now we can see that as the cliff moves closer, the house itself is sticking to the cliff because it's in the same z-axis plane. And that's it. If we just hit the space bar to see what this looks like, we have a little bit of motion on the water that we can see. We've got the fish swimming here. If we wanted to, we could add another light out here. We've got our, we're kind of zooming into the space. We have our weather balloon here. The other fish is somewhere over here. We don't know where it is. So here's what we've got so far. I could see adding one more element to the front here. It's just an overall like cloud so that it feels like there's one more element that's kind of occluding things. So let's go ahead and go to our background, find that clouds 3 layer, and this time I'm going to drag it with the option key held down, and I'm going to drag it into the front folder here, like right there, and hold the option key down. Let's do this again, into the front folder and let go. And what that does is it puts a copy of that cloud with the throw into the front folder, which brings it, right to the front. We know we have to go to properties and change the properties to 0 for the z-axis. And now if I move this cloud layer around, you see we have some clouds obviously start around here, and then you can kind of see how they add a little bit of atmosphere to this front area, right? Because of that throw. And in fact, if you want to make the size bigger and increase the throw rate so that it throws faster just because it's closer, you could do that and it'll feel a little bit more authentic, right? So let's add one more light maybe in, or change the ambient light maybe. Let's go to that ambient light and maybe just bring it up a little bit so we have a little bit more definition of what we're seeing here. When you're ready to export for an assignment, you just hit the share button just like we always have. Hit export movie default. Make sure your settings are set to audio video H.264, and make sure when you're rendering, you render the right camera. And this is the cool part because you can add as many cameras as you want. The camera I'm currently viewing has motion on it, but if I added another camera like this camera and I call it Castle, what I could do with this camera is select it here and now just change the framing so that just my castle was actually selected. So here's my castle. I might want to move down. So I'm going to move this whole thing down here. And now I've got a different camera, and you notice this is the shot with that camera, right? So I've got my main camera, which has the movement, you see? And then I've got my castle camera. And you can export each one of these to Premiere using the same share button. And again, when you share it, make sure you select the camera that you want to actually export. In this case, I want to do castle camera. Maybe I want to do the main, or I could do both one after another. And then let's go ahead and do main, hit next. And we're going to save that. As soon as this little render thing stops rendering, you will see a movie on your desktop, and that is what you will turn in as your finished diorama. Oh, one last thing. Didn't want to put this in, but I noticed that when I rendered it, notice how there's some issues here with flickering. That was for one reason. Under the share for motion, when I exported it, under settings or render, I picked the right camera, but I did not use the best quality. So make sure this is always checked best. You will notice it. Hit next. And then render it again. I'm going to replace that one. And it takes a little bit longer to render the best quality, but not much. But you'll notice the flickering that happened on the house is not going to happen again. And you can see now there's no flickering here. And this is our final scene with a little bit of motion movement in the camera. Okay, thanks. Hope you liked.